Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rajapurkar and Dr. Atul Mule. Dr. Atul Mule has actually made my job extremely simple because he has covered virtually everything. So I am now, what I would like all the participants to do is to have the printout of the paper and the printout of the checklist in front of them. You had already received an instruction that you should have a printout, because unless you have this in front of you, it will be no fun. So I'll just give maybe a couple of minutes for everyone to get their printouts in front of them, in front of their computers. And in the meantime, I'll share my screen. All right, so we're going to try and make this as interactive as possible. So from time to time, I would be mentioning the names of some participants, and I would request them to give their opinion about various aspects of the critical appraisal of this RCT paper. So you all know that this is the paper that we are discussing: sodium bicarbonate therapy for patients with severe metabolic acidemia in the intensive care unit. It was a multi-centric, open-label, randomized controlled trial, phase 3, and it was conducted in France, in Europe, basically. So we are going to use a very standard checklist known as the CASP checklist, CASP. CASP stands for Critical Appraisal Skill Program. It's a program that has been running for the last 25 years by an Oxford-based organization, and it's a very widely used checklist all over the world. They have different checklists for different types of studies. So until now, I think they have published 8 such checklists. So they have different ones for RCTs, for diagnostic tests, for systematic reviews, etc., etc. Okay. So our first question in the checklist is, did the trial address a clearly focused issue? And we have to make up our minds whether it was yes, or can't tell, or no. And they have given us some hints. They have said that a clearly focused issue is one in which can be expressed as a PICO question, or a PICO test question, if you want to add TE and S also to it. So can I ask Vinay, Dr. Vinay Joshi, to unmute himself? And hello, Dr. Vinay. Dr. Vinay Joshi, can you unmute yourself? Okay, if
Hello.
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 Hello, yes. Vinay, have you unmuted yourself?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah.
So what do you think was the PICO question in this trial? And where would you get that information for formulating a PICO question
I
in this
think if you
paper?
look at the heading of the trial, the
Yeah.
title of the trial,
Yes.
yeah, that itself will tell you whether it will tell you the PICO format. Most of the questions should be answered in that.
Okay. So which parts of the PICO are answered from just the title?
Like, did the bicarb,
So what is the population? P.
Sir, you've gone.
Hello?
Dr. Vinay has gone mute.
Oh, is it? No, but he hasn't answered the question. Dr. Vinay, could you please unmute yourself? Hello?
I guess there is some problem with the.
Some problem. Okay. Dr. Vijay, would you like to take this question? Dr. Vijay, can you unmute yourself? Dr. Vijay Joshi?
Hello. Yes, sir. I have unmuted myself.
Yeah. So let's formulate the PICO question for this trial.
Yes, sir.
Where would you
Vijay,
find?
can you mute your speaker? Because what you're speaking is kind of.
Is it right, sir, now?
Dr. Vijay, yeah, it's fine. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hello.
Dr. Vijay,
Yes, sir.
please continue. Yeah.
Sir, the population would be patients with severe metabolic acidemia in intensive care unit.
Mm-hmm.
The intervention would be sodium bicarb therapy.
So what kind of intensive care unit? Neonatal, pediatric,
No, sir, adult.
adult ICU. Yeah. So patients in
Adult.
an adult ICU who have severe
Yes, sir.
metabolic acidemia. Yeah. So what is the intervention, the I component?
Intervention would be sodium bicarb therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Comparator would be
Sodium bicarb therapy, early, late, in the middle, just before the patient is going to die.
no early.
Early, yeah.
Within,
So early
within
sodium bicarb.
48 hours of admission.
That's right. So all these things make a difference, because each of them becomes a different question. Suppose I say, if you give the bicarbonate midway or in extremis, it will have a completely different implication.
Right, sir.
Okay.
Within 40
Comparison?
comparison would be the placebo arm.
Did they give a placebo?
But they haven't given anything.
So yeah, so it's not a placebo. The comparison is actually no bicarbonate infusion.
No bicarb therapy, sorry.
Right. So as we will see soon, this was an open label trial.
Yes, sir.
In an open label trial, there is no question of a placebo. I mean, you will want to give a placebo if your intention is to blind.
Right.
If there is no intention to blind, what is the point in giving a placebo?
Right, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir, I understand.
Comparison is no infusion. What is the outcome?
Outcome would be a composite outcome of 7-day organ failure, any organ failure, and 28-day mortality.
Yeah. So a composite outcome of these two, and Dr. Atul Mulay has already discussed at length with you the problems sometimes associated with composite outcomes. So both the components of the outcomes should have at least roughly equal severity or implication from a patient's point of view. Okay.
Yes, sir.
So a lot of people, they extend the PICO question to make it PICO test.
Okay.
So what is the T in PICO test? So T is the time over which the outcome is going to be measured for any individual patient. So the outcome itself is a death or single organ failure. The T is 28 days for mortality and 7 days for organ failure. That's the T.
Right.
E stands for effect size. So what is the effect size planned out in this trial? Not what they got at the end. So what is E?
Sir, I'm not sure about that. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So the E comes from their section on sample size calculation.
Okay, sir.
So if you have the paper in front of you, and if you go to page number 4, everybody can go to page number 4, right hand side column. The E, PICO test E was have you spotted it?
Yeah, decrease from assuming that administration of sodium bicarb would be associated with decrease from 45 to 30% in the primary endpoint.
Correct. So the E, the effect size they had planned for was a 15% absolute reduction from a baseline of 45%. What it turned out was quite different, of course, as already discussed, but that was the E. And the S stands for study design, because the same question can be answered by different kinds of study designs. So in this case, of course, it's a randomized control trial. So the complete question, the complete hypothesis was as follows, right? So you got this information from these parts of the study.
Right, sir.
so this was the last part of the introduction. Then a bit of the methods where they're defining what they mean by acidemia, and a little bit from the statistical analysis, which told you how much was the effect size. So these are the different parts of the place from where the PCOTES question can be generated. So
Okay, sir.
basically, the trial did address a clearly focused issue. So I put up the answer on the slide now. Yes.
Yes.
So what was the full question? Among adult ICU patients with severe metabolic acidosis, early bicarbonate infusion, which is I, compared to no infusion, which is C, will result in 15% less, that means 45% to 30%, that is E, of the composite outcome of all-cause mortality and at least one organ failure, that is O, by day 28 and day 7 respectively, that is the T, in a randomized control trial, that is the S. So the whole thing, when written out as a flowing sentence in English, becomes the hypothesis for this study. So it was a clearly focused issue.
Right. Sir.
Right? Okay.
Yes. Sir. Thank you, sir.
We now go on to the next question. And Umapati, are you here? Dr. Umapati Hegde? Dr. Umapati Hegde, are you here? Can you unmute yourself? Dr. Umapati? Okay, if not Dr. Umapati, Dr. Vaishali. Dr. Vaishali More, are you here? Dr. Vaishali, can you unmute yourself? Dr. Vaishali More or Dr. Umapati? Okay, I don't know. A lot of people seem to have logged in and then just disappeared. Dr. Suryashri, Dr. Suryashri Pandey, can you unmute yourself? Dr. Suryashri. Okay, why don't I do one thing? Can someone volunteer to answer this question? It will be for your own benefit. I mean, you will learn more than the others. Hello? Hello?
Hello? Yeah,
can
you hear me?
No, I can't hear you. It's coming very, very broken.
Can you hear me now?
No, I cannot hear you.
Too many people
Voice
have
is quite
unmuted.
broken.
That
No, Dr. Umapati is not unmuted. Dr. Vaishali is also not unmuted. So I don't think.
Can I?
Yeah, may I know who's speaking? Hello.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Preeta.
Okay, go ahead, Dr. Preeta. Thank you for volunteering. That's good. Okay.
So
the second question, was the assignment of patients to treatments randomized? So the hints they have given us are, consider how this was carried out. Was the allocation sequence concealed from researchers and patients?
So for the first question, how this was carried out, so where do I find it? I find it in the method section.
Yeah.
And under randomization and masking, they have actually given a detailed structure of what they've done.
Correct. So for everybody, that is on page number 3, left-hand side column. Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Preeta.
Yeah, so it was carried out because obviously they've mentioned it. And the second question was the allocation. So it was, so what they did was they did a computer generated allocation. So when you do a computer generated, it will also be concealed is what I would think based on how they then put it. I don't know, after generating, they put it in envelopes or then those issues are there. But it looks like they've concealed it is what I would say, unless it's given somewhere else. Yeah, I don't know.
Your guess is that it's probably concealed.
Yeah.
And we are happy with the randomization. They say that they did stratification according to study site and 3 pre-specified factors: age with a cutoff of 65, presence or absence of suspected sepsis, and an Akin score of 2 or 3.
Yeah.
as opposed to 0 or 1.
Yeah.
Okay, let's actually see, because it's not as simple as it sounds.
Right. Yeah.
So this is the paragraph you've been referring to, right? So we
Yeah.
randomize 1:1 ratio, stratified randomization with this strange thing called minimization, which Dr. Atul alluded to. Computer generated allocation sequence, stratification according to 3 parameters. Okay, now let's go over each of these things one by one and let's try to understand them. So how do you randomize? You use, statistical software packages or internet websites to randomize. So you say that, okay, this is my sample size, say 400. Now convert the numbers 1 to 400 in a random sequence. And then those numbers are converted into intervention groups. Generally, one designates odds as intervention or evens as controls, or various other ways that the computer uses for that thing. So imagine that there is a random number sequence here: 63, 48, 277, etc., 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 going on, say up to 400 or 500 or 600 or whatever. So we convert odds into intervention, evens into control. So 48 becomes control, 2 becomes control, 77 becomes intervention, and so on and so forth. So you have a random order of interventions and controls. Right? So far, simple. An important thing is one should not take steps to force equal numbers in the two groups in simple randomization, because that creates a problem towards the end of the study. The last few patients become predictable as to what they're going to get. So you should not try to force equal numbers. Now, when you have small sample sizes, 2 problems may occur by random chance. One is you may end up having grossly unequal numbers in the 2 arms, or you may have grossly unequal distribution of some confounding variables or baseline risk factors in the 2 arms. The first of these problems on the left-hand side may result in a loss of power if there is extremely great unequal numbers in the 2 arms. Minor differences in numbers don't make any difference at all. So people often get very agitated, a few numbers here or there are unequal, but it doesn't make any difference. Sometimes it requires almost 1.5:1 ratio between the 2 arms to really result in a major loss of power. So the solution for this at the planning stage is something known as block randomization. On the other hand, you could have grossly unequal distribution of a confounding variable, and this may result in a confounding bias. And the solution for this at the planning stage is known as stratified randomization. When you do stratified,
Sir, you have gone mute again.
so as you will, am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
So as you will soon see, if you plan to do stratified randomization, you have to also do block randomization. Otherwise, it renders the whole process of stratification meaningless. But if you do block randomization, there is no compulsion to do stratified randomization. You can have block randomization being done alone, but if you stratify, you have to block. That's compulsory. So how does one block? Let's take an example. Imagine there are 30 patients to be randomly allocated to either blue treatment or red treatment. So these are my 30 patients to start with, lined up 1 to 30. So what you do is you choose a convenient number of even numbered groups, say 5 groups of 6 subjects each to make it 30. So my first group is 6 patients, second group is 6 patients, and so on to 5 groups. Within each group, we randomly allocate to blue and red treatment in a 1:1 ratio. So that means the first group is blue, red, red, blue, blue, red. Second group is blue, blue, red, 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 blue, and so on. So at the end of each group, you have 3 reds and 3 blues. So what you have done is you have ensured that you have equal reds and equal blues at the end of the trial, as well as at the end of every block, the numbers again equalize. Equal reds and equal blues. However, in unblinded trials, unpredictability is lost towards the end of each block, because you know that there have to be 3 reds and 3 blues, right? If you know the block sizes, and these are unblinded trials. So you will know what the last few patients are going to get. often the sixth patient you definitely know, sometimes even the fifth patient you know beforehand. So unpredictability is lost. So there is no concealment of allocation. So to overcome that in unblinded trials, you are strongly recommended to construct randomly varying block sizes. That means even the block sizes are not fixed. They're not fixed at 6. So your first block may be 4, second is 8, third is 6, fourth is 4, then again 8, sometimes 12, and so on and so forth. So nobody knows when the blocks are starting and finishing. So it is impossible to predict, therefore, what the next patient is going to get. So this is all about blocking. How does one stratify? So imagine a sample size of 30. Your concern is that gender could be a confounder if it is unequally distributed. So here are your 30 patients. The pinks are the women, the blues are the men. So I'm a pediatrician, right? So we always talk of pinks and blues for girls and boys. So I put pinks and blues for women and men. So what you have to do is, you have to first, as the patients get enrolled in the trial, they are first stratified into 2 strata, females and males. Amongst the females, within each stratum, you do block randomization to receive solid treatment and dotted treatment. So amongst the women, you are having block of 4, block of 6, block of 4, etc., etc. So varying sized, even numbered blocks. Within each block, there is an equal number of solid treatment and dotted treatment, if assuming that solid and dot are the 2 treatments. So similarly with the men, what that ensures is that the male and female ratio amongst the solid treatment becomes identical to the male and female ratio amongst the dotted treatment at the end of the trial. That is how stratification helps to ensure that a confounder that you are worried about, that if it gets unequally balanced, it will create a problem. It gets balanced by doing stratification and then blocking within each stratum and doing randomization. Now, stratification becomes difficult if you have too many strata. So if you're stratifying for only one thing, it's all right. But if you're stratifying for many things, it becomes a problem. So here is a table. Imagine that, the blue table, and this is exactly the 3 criteria that they had used in their trial. So their strata were age, either more than 65 or less than or equal to 65, sepsis or no sepsis, Akin score 0 to 1 or Akin score 2 to 3. Now, within each substratum, you will have to do randomization. So let us see, it is also randomized by center. So let us look at the first center. So the first center would have a stratum consisting of those above 65 with sepsis and Akin score 0 to 1. There would be another stratum with those who are above 65 but who do not have sepsis but have Akin score 0 to 1. Then you would need those above 65 with no sepsis and Akin score 2 to 3. Then you would need age more than 65 with sepsis and Akin score 2 to 3. Then, and that's not the end of the story. Now you need age less than 65 with sepsis with Akin score 0 to 1. Then you need one stratum, age less than 65, no sepsis, Akin score 0 to 1. So you have so many substrata. Within each substratum, you will have to do randomization. You can imagine how complex this trial will become. So, and so on. So that means the total number of strata will be the number of centers, because within each center, all this rigmarole is happening. So within each center multiplied by 2 raised to the power n, where n is the total number of strata. So you end up having an impossibly large number of strata to deal with. So we will come to one of the solutions for this, and that is called minimization in a short while. So there are many online websites which allow you to create random number lists. I am very fond of this one, randomization.com. Randomization spelled with a Z. So imagine I'm doing a trial comparing prophylactic fluconazole versus placebo to prevent invasive fungal infections. So supposing I have calculated that my sample size is 150. So that 150, I now break it up into blocks of various sizes. So how will I do it? I want to have randomly varying blocks. So and this is just entirely up to me. I take 10 blocks with 8 patients each. That means 8 patients per block, 10 such blocks, and 7 blocks which are going to have 10 patients each. So that makes it 80 plus 70, that totals up to 150, which is my total sample size. So my 150, I want it to be broken into 10 blocks of 8 each and 7 blocks of 10 each. So I enter all this into this program. I enter my 2 interventions, fluconazole and placebo, and then I click here which says generate plan. Once I click on generate plan, this is what appears. So they say that your first patient should get placebo, second fluconazole, third fluconazole, fourth fluconazole, etc., etc. So they've created a whole list going all the way to 150. And now I don't know which are the 10 sized blocks and which are the 8 sized blocks, because they are all going to come in random sequence. So I have no way of predicting what the next patient is going to get. So this is how the randomization sequence is made. So the person who is making this randomization sequence should not be involved in the actual conduction of the trial, because that person knows the sequence. One person who knows the sequence should not be part of the trial. So next concept, we have made our randomization sequence, so concealment of allocation. So the group to which the subject has been allocated must not be known till the point of randomization. So examples of non-concealment are open randomization charts put up on notice boards or quasi-randomization. So because non-concealment invalidates the whole process of randomization. There's no point having randomization if you know beforehand what the next person is going to get. So what are the methods of concealment? In blinded randomized control trials, the blinding automatically ensures concealment by itself. You don't need to do anything special. In unblinded randomized control trials, you use serially numbered opaque sealed envelopes, or called SNOs, with slips bearing the intervention. But as we will soon see, this trial used a third method called minimization, in which the methods of concealment are a little different. So this is what the envelope looks like in unblinded trials. So sealed envelope, which should be opaque, subject identification written on top, and the slip bearing. So concealment of allocation prevents allocation bias. How does it do that? So let us take an example of non-concealment of allocation. So supposing we are comparing treatment A versus treatment B. So the research staff, assuming they are biased in favor of the new treatment B, and whether treatment A should be given or B should be given is written on slips of paper and put inside envelopes. And supposing these envelopes are not opaque, so that means you can hold up the envelope against the bulb and see what is written inside the envelope. So that means you know beforehand what the next patient is going to get. So what is going to happen? If the next eligible patient looks like he or she is likely to have a good outcome, less complications, this is how you land up there to take consent. If the next eligible patient looks like he or she is likely to have a bad outcome and you don't want that patient in the trial because you know that it's going to go to treatment B arm beforehand, then this is how you land up to take consent. Your body language itself will be such that the patient will not feel like participating in the trial. So you would have achieved your biased objective. That means someone who has likely to have a bad outcome, you know is going to go to treatment B, you have automatically eliminated them from the trial. They'll not even participate. So concealment of allocation bias is prevented by ensuring tamper-proof opaque sealed envelopes. Now, what is this thing called minimization? Now, it's a crowded slide, and we'll go over it one by one to understand things. So I just want you to focus your attention on the top, the text on the top. So let's assume the authors want the proportion of subjects with age more than 65, presence of sepsis, an Atkins score of 2 to 3 to be equal between the two arms of the study. They're really desperate that the proportion with age more than 65 in the intervention arm should be same as the proportion in the control arm. The proportion with sepsis in the intervention arm should be the same as the proportion of sepsis in the control arm, and similarly with Atkins score. And let us assume that these three confounders are of equal importance. So what they do is, and I draw your attention to the box on the left hand side, the small box. So there are three variables. age more than 65, sepsis, and Akin score 2 to 3. So each of them is given 1 point. 1 point. So that means a patient who has all the 3 risk factors is contributing 3 points. Someone who has none is contributing 0 points, and so on. Now, the table on the right side, the blue table, we are going to go row by row. And what does this table show? That for each patient, how does that patient score on these 3 important risk factors, age, sepsis, and Akin? How does the software decide into which group to put this patient into? And after each patient enters the trial, what is the cumulative number of points in the 2 arms of the trial, namely the bicarbonate arm and the control arm? So first patient comes who is eligible. We feed into the computer that the patient has age more than 65, has sepsis, but does not have an Akin score of 2 or 3. The first patient is decided on a random basis. The software just decides at random, and it turns out that the patient goes into the control arm. If the patient goes into the control arm now has 2 cumulative points. Those 2 points have come from 1 point from this patient's age, 1 point from sepsis. Second patient comes. This patient has an age of more than 65, no sepsis, no Akin 2 to 3. So that means it has 1 point. The software will try to put this patient into that arm which tries to balance off the cumulative number of points in the 2 arms. So because the control arm already has 2 points, this patient now will be put by the software into the bicarb arm. So this patient's fate has been decided by the previous patient's fate. So second patient's fate was decided because of the first patient's fate. So in order to try and balance the risk factors, the software puts this patient into the bicarb arm. So after this patient now, bicarb 1, control 2, like a football match. Now third patient comes. Third patient age is less than 65, but has sepsis and Akin 2 to 3. So the score of 2. The bicarb arm is still trailing the control arm by by 1. So the software now decides to put this patient also into the bicarb arm. Having put this patient in the bicarb arm, now the bicarb arm is 3, control is 2. Fourth patient comes who has only 1 point from sepsis. The software decides this patient has to go into the control arm because the score is prior to this was 3-2 in favor of bicarb. So it has to try and bring it to 3-3. The fifth patient comes. Now because both are 3-3, the software says that, okay, now it doesn't matter. By random process, I will decide. So it decides to put it into the bicarb arm by random process. So now the score becomes 6-3. The sixth patient comes, has no risk factors. The software decides that, oh, a score of 0. This patient had better go into the bicarb arm because bicarb is already leading 6-3. So it puts it into the bicarb arm, so 6-3. Seventh patient comes, it has a score of 2. Software says, oh no, bicarb is leading 6-3. This patient should go into the control arm to make it 6-5. So this process keeps continuing throughout the trial. So all 400 patients, each patient's fate is decided by what the previous patients have gone into. Now the trouble with minimization is that if research staff are clever and they themselves start keeping track of the baseline characteristics of patients, it becomes possible for them to guess what the software is going to decide for the next patient. So concealment of allocation will be destroyed. So to ensure concealment of allocation, a random element is introduced into this process, say 75% probability. What it means is that at each step where the software is deciding, it flicks a biased coin. It doesn't say that, okay, it is currently in favor of bicarb 6-3, so the next patient must go into the control arm. No, there is no guarantee. The patient will have a higher chance of going to the control arm in a 75-25 ratio, but may go into the bicarb arm again because there is no guarantee. So you can put in a random element, and in fact you should put in a random element in all minimization studies. So what happened in this trial? Getting back to this trial, was the assignment of patients to treatments randomized? We can't tell. The reason is that in stratified randomization with stratification, this is what they did. They did not do blocking, which is why I think there is actually a problem with the language of the study rather than the science, because normally it would have been a stratified block randomization. They did not do. So, and they have not mentioned which variables they use for minimization. Now, obviously, minimization cannot be done for those variables which you have already stratified for, because there will be no variability of those variables within each stratum. Everybody within a stratum has the same variables. So to my mind, they stratified only for center. They never stratified for these things. These were the variables used for minimization rather than stratification. And it is not clear whether a random element was introduced in the minimization. They haven't mentioned that. So if they haven't, in an open label trial, that could be a disaster, because everyone would know what the next patient is going to get without a random element in minimization. And theirs was an open label trial. So in an open label trial, without the random element in minimization, the concealment of allocation is lost. So therefore, I cannot tell whether concealment of allocation was concealed from researchers and patients in this randomized control trial, published in the Lancet, by the way. Okay, now let's move on to number 3. And can I request Dr. Subal Pradhan? Dr. Subal, if you can unmute yourself, please. Or if there's anybody who wants to volunteer, please unmute yourself and volunteer.
Hi, this is Sridhara.
Doctor?
Sridhara.
Okay, yeah, very good. Thanks for volunteering. So this question is, were all the patients who entered the trial properly accounted for at its conclusion?
Yeah, it seems so. From table 1, the trial profile, they have 942 patients.
You mean figure 1?
Figure 1, sir. It
Figure.
says actually table 1 here. Figure 1.
Figure 1, yeah.
So 942 patients were assessed for eligibility. 400 were randomized and 542 excluded, and they have given the reasons for exclusion.
Yeah.
Out of 400, 201 assigned to control group, 199 to the bicarbonate. There were 7 and 4 withdrawals, so the remaining numbers match. And subsequently, some violation of the criteria and intervention which was not intended are also there. So therefore, I think all the numbers do match up.
The numbers add up. So the whole thing is that the numbers should all add up. There should be no patients who is unaccounted for, because if the unaccounted patient, then you start smelling that there is some problem in this trial. Okay, so you're absolutely right, and you very rightly said that this is you've seen in trial profile 1, those 400 that were randomized are all accounted for. The 201 and 199 adds up to 400. If you take care of the withdrawal of consents, then the 194 plus 195 plus the withdrawal of consents again adds up to 400, and 132 plus 179 plus those who violated protocol again adds up to 400. So there is no problem, completely transparent, well described. So therefore, all those who entered the trial were probably accounted for at its conclusion. There was a 400 planned sample size, all accounted for. There were 1 or 2 interim analysis planned, and I'm not clear how many, because in one place in the paper they say only 1 interim analysis at 200 patients. At another place they say 2 interim analyses were planned, so I'm not sure. But I guess the Data Safety Monitoring Board must have asked for continuation of the trial during the interim analysis, which is why it continued till the end, where they finally got all their 400 patients. And so therefore they have not bothered to tell us what were the results of the interim analysis. Just a few words about interim analysis and stopping rules. The purpose of the interim analysis is threefold. Either you terminate the trial midway for unequivocal benefit of the intervention, so that the remaining patients in the control arm are not deprived of the benefit of the intervention, because it would then become unethical to have any more patients going into the control arm. Or it could be to terminate the trial midway for harm by the intervention, so that the remaining patients in the intervention arm are not harmed for the rest of the trial. Or to terminate the trial midway for futility, because there is no chance of either finding benefit or harm. The two groups are so similar, so that you can better conserve your resources and do some other trial instead of continuing with a futile trial. Okay, there are some dangers of interim analysis which Dr. Mule has already highlighted. Each look at the data interim increases the probability of arriving at a statistically significant difference in the primary outcome just by random chance. That is the alpha error. And the cumulative alpha error of the primary outcome of the full trial now starts exceeding 5%, because at every interim analysis, you have already committed a 5% alpha error. So unnecessarily statistical testing should be avoided. Each time you perform an interim analysis, you're running the risk of a 5% alpha error. So, you should always try to avoid the temptation of having periodic intermittent looks at your data. And the cumulative alpha error soon builds up according to this formula. So this is showing you the cumulative alpha error, how it is building up. Just a little cartoon to highlight the point. So the whole idea is not to torture your data till it confesses and spits out a p-value. Okay, we now move on to the fourth question. And can someone volunteer? I think that is simpler, because the names I'm reading out, people are not unmuting themselves. Yeah, can someone volunteer?
Sir, I'm Arpana from Bangalore.
Yeah, Arpana, please.
So the question is, were patients, health workers, and study personnel blind to treatment?
Yeah.
So with regard to patients, there is a mention in the method section that they were sick and a deferred consent was taken. So obviously, at the time of recruitment into either arm, the patients per se were quite sick and they were not involved in a consent, but the patient attender or family member would have given consent, and therefore it's not clear to me whether they have given consent fully knowing that the patient will be subjected to either arm. Probably,
no, but does giving consent automatically mean that you are unblinded?
No.
Or blinded? I mean, are the two things in any way related?
Yes. No, that's not directly giving us any information about blinding, but I'm just looking at the process that the patient is not aware about whether he is going to be in the control arm or the intervention arm.
No, but even if the patient was fully conscious and capable of giving consent and there was no deferred consent, even then the patient may not be aware of whether he or she would go into the intervention arm or the control arm. So it is not the consent that decides whether the patient was blinded or not.
Okay.
It was whether they used a placebo treatment that was absolutely identical to their intervention.
No, they didn't.
They did
Here
not.
they didn't. So the patient wouldn't know when several injections were given.
Yeah.
They wouldn't know whether they.
So the patients all knew. Whoever was getting the bicarb knew they were getting the bicarb. The study personnel also knew that they were getting the bicarb, and the authors have been very open about it.
Yes.
In the methods, first line of the methods.
Yes.
Yeah. First line of the methods, they say we did an open label trial. Open label is opposite of blinded. Okay, the term open label.
My confusion was when they are not conscious. How do we interpret whether they were aware of it? Meaning, can we interpret
so
blind when they are not conscious?
Yeah, so if a person remains unconscious throughout a trial, then that person, of course, remains blinded.
Yes. That's it. Yes.
Yeah. So these days, it's important not to use the terms double blind and triple blind. They're obsolete. Please do not use them. You are supposed to list all those categories of individuals who are blinded or not blinded.
Okay.
For example, I'm a neonatologist.
Yes, sir.
If I say, oh, it's a double blind trial because the patient was blinded, of course, all my patients are blinded. I mean, they are 5 days old. So obviously they don't know, anything of what is happening to them.
Yes.
But if I go and tell their parents that, oh, they're in the treatment arm or placebo arm, then that doesn't make it double blinded. So it's important for me to say that parents were blinded or not. I have to specify. I can't just leave it as double blind because that's open to interpretation. Okay.
Yes, sir.
So methods of blinding are that the drug should be identical to the placebo in appearance and smell, and also after reconstitution. Containers should be identical, and do not designate interventions as drug A and drug B, because a single typical side effect may ruin the whole blinding process and unravel the entire randomization sequence. So basically, bottles are numbered serially on the outside with the contents as per the random sequence. Not applicable in this trial because they did not even attempt to blind. Okay. Now note one thing, envelopes bearing treatment, that is fluconazole or placebo, they ensure concealment of allocation. That means nobody knows what the next patient is going to get till such time that the envelope is torn open. But envelopes do not ensure blinding, because once the envelope is open, you know this patient has to be given plus fluconazole. It's written there. Okay. So envelopes are used only for unblinded trials, not for blinded trials. Because in blinded trials, the blinding process itself ensures concealment of allocation. So blinding prevents measurement bias. When the investigator knows which group the patient belongs to, he or she can become biased while measuring an outcome. And in this trial that we are seeing, one of the outcomes did not have any bias. That was all-cause mortality. You know, there can't be any measurement bias while declaring someone dead because of all-cause mortality. But there can be a measurement bias for the other part of the composite outcome, and that was single organ failure. You know, that is open to interpretation. There is a little bit of subjectivity to my saying that there is an organ failure or not an organ failure. So one has to be cautious about that. So what happens when there is no blinding? Say suppose it's a new antihypertensive versus an old antihypertensive. So subjects that are in the new antihypertensive group, doctor is biased towards the new antihypertensive. He says, I have taken the BP thrice. I guess the lowest value must be the correct one. Subjects that are in the standard antihypertensive group, same blood pressure, the doctor says, I have taken the BP thrice. Now let me record the average value of the three. By systematically doing this difference in measurement, because you know which group the patient is, you create measurement bias in the trial. So it is prevented by blinding the investigators and ensuring high quality, highly standardized measurement techniques. Okay, so let's go over this whole process: randomization, concealment of allocation, and blinding. So you start off with a random number list. That random number list is converted into intervention and control. Some websites will start off directly from this stage, intervention, like that fluconazole versus placebo website I showed. There was no random number list being shown to you, that was happening in the background. So you directly got fluconazole, placebo, placebo, fluconazole, fluconazole, placebo, etc., etc. If it is a blinded trial, then the bottles are all serially numbered on the outside, and their contents have the intervention or the placebo solution inside the bottle. When the first patient is enrolled, you put a needle into the first bottle and you give whatever is there. Second patient is enrolled, you put a needle into the second bottle and give whatever is there. So in sequence, you are giving patients whatever is there inside the bottles, and it's a random sequence. In an open label trial, this is what usually happens. So there are envelopes. Within each envelope, there is a slip of paper. First patient gets enrolled. First envelope opened, it says give the intervention. Second patient gets enrolled, you open the envelope, it says give the placebo. Third patient enrolled, opens the envelope, it says give the placebo. Fourth patient, give the intervention, and so on and so forth. Now remember, in this trial where there is minimization, where each patient's, what that patient is to get is not pre-decided. So there is no pre-existing randomization list. There is no pre-existing set of envelopes with, what to give the patient already there inside the envelope. It doesn't exist. For each patient, the computer now decides which arm the patient has to go to, based upon what previous patients have gone to, which arms previous patients have gone to. It's a very interesting way of randomization, because nothing is decided in advance. It is all on the go, depending on what previous patients have received. So who should be blinded? As I said, subjects, patients administering the intervention and co-intervention, patients measuring the outcome, and statistician, and specify who was blinded. Don't call it double blind or triple blind. Just a little cartoon, what I was telling you earlier. The protocol says the patient must be kept blinded, so I haven't told him anything, but there was no mention about the parent. So I guess it's okay to tell you that he is in the placebo arm. Okay, the difference between the three. So randomization is the process by which group allocation sequence is made unpredictable. Concealment of allocation in an open label trials, nobody knows the group allocation sequence until after the patient is consented and enrolled, but group allocation is revealed once the intervention is administered. In blinded trials, the concealment of allocation is maintained to the very end of the trial, even after the intervention has been administered, because the intervention looks just like the placebo. What is blinding? The group allocation is not known even after the intervention is administered. So blinding automatically ensures concealment of allocation. So therefore, the answer to the question, the long and short of it, were patients blind? No, they were not blinded. And because it was an open label trial. So were the groups similar at the start of the trial? Next question. Can somebody volunteer?
Sir, just to complete the fourth question,
Okay,
the
yeah.
health workers were not blinded, but
Yeah.
the study personnel were blinded.
Is that written somewhere?
Yes, it is written in the discussion as a limitation.
But in the methods, I don't think they have mentioned
in the methods they
anywhere
don't
a list
mention.
of, because normally you should, in the methods, you're expected to
It have
mention
written, yes.
who were blinded, who were unblinded.
That is not clear,
That
but in
is
the
not
discussion,
mentioned.
in the last page, they write that it is a limitation that we could not blind the health workers, but however, we have taken care that the study personnel were masked from the intervention given to the patient.
Yeah, so you have to take that with a pinch of salt, you know, if it's not mentioned in the methods.
Yes.
And one should go to the trial registration site, because it would have been registered under clinicaltrials.gov and see what was actually there in the protocol.
Okay.
Okay, that's important. Okay, so next one. Were the groups similar at the start of the trial? Volunteers?
Dr. Sri Priya, I have
Yes,
unmuted you. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Can you hear me, sir?
Yeah, very clearly. Doctor, what's your name?
Shri Priya.
Sri Priya.
Sri Priya. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, Sri Priya.
So, were the groups similar at the start of the trial? This information is given in table number 1, where they have explained all the criteria under which they have compared both the control and the bicarbonate group.
Yeah.
So,
So
going by the percentages,
they've given a huge
long
table,
list.
right? Long table going over 2 pages.
Yes, sir.
So this is, I know I put the table in front of you. So if you just eyeball the information, it looks pretty similar. They look fairly balanced. There's no very abnormal figures on either side of the table. And note that there are no p-values. There are no p-values. And that is the correct way to show a table of baseline characteristics. The reason is that the term p-value, P stands for probability. So it's the probability that the differences that you're seeing have occurred because of random chance. Now, in a randomized control trial, unlike any other kind of study, all differences at baseline are because of random chance and nothing else. Isn't it?
Yes.
These are all baseline values. These are not something that have come up after the intervention. So they are at baseline. When patients are randomly allocated, all differences are because of random chance. So the p-value of all these is actually equal to 1. 100% probability that they are because of random chance. So therefore, p-values are not shown in the table of baseline characteristics. And therefore, I'm sure you will agree with me that yes, the groups were rather similar at the start of the trial. And as you've correctly pointed out, table number 1. Okay. So Dr. Sri Priya, would you also like to take the next question?
Yes, sir. Sure.
Yeah.
Sir, can I make a comment?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think in the background of critically ill patients, there were many issues that were not taken into consideration. What they took into consideration looks equal. Things which would affect outcome would be factors like fluid overload, the number of vasoactive drugs that are being used in each group. If they just put vasopressors and numbers, but it would be very different if it was one vasopressor and 3. And
Yeah,
same goes for ventilation.
True.
And the hematological is put as 0. Most, the number of septic patients who are critically ill, a reasonable number would have thrombocytopenia. I don't see that reflecting anywhere.
Yeah,
and
sometimes
these will affect the outcome.
Yeah, sometimes what may happen is, after all, it is endless the number of things one could study in critically sick patients that could affect the outcome. And if they have taken some composite scores like Maccabe class or SOFA scores, which in turn cover many of these individual components, then you can probably do away with showing each of those individual items that may affect the outcome. So I guess that may have been their logic. And they have, in fact, given overall vasopressor support, overall invasive mechanical ventilation support. I agree with you that, there could be many things one could think of which could individually affect the outcome, but perhaps some of them would get clubbed under these surrogate markers like SOFA score and Maccabe class and so on. And even the Akin status to an extent. So I am, in that sense, giving them the benefit of doubt that since from all other angles, they do look very similar. It's probably unlikely that, one very important thing is highly dissimilar, which they have overlooked. Okay. That's, all I can say at the moment. So Dr. Sripriya, going on to question number 6.
Yes, aside from the experimental intervention where the groups treated equally, so this information is given in procedures. The first paragraph gives us the control group and the bicarbonate group, how they have given bicarbonate. Subsequently,
Yeah, but
they have said,
bicarbonate is the treatment itself, right? That's not.
Yes.
That's not a
In the second paragraph, they have said indications for renal replacement therapy were standardized in both the groups. So that kind of answers in part whether they were treated equally.
Yeah,
so they have
but it answers very little actually, because the renal replacement was an outcome. It was one of the secondary outcomes.
Yes.
It is not a co-intervention or a routine part of care of the of these patients.
Yes.
So
and
in fact, this study, go ahead. Yeah.
There is one more last line which says invasive mechanical ventilation was indicated, only the initiation. So the rest of it they have not given actually what they have done for the patients.
Yeah. So in fact, reflecting what the somebody had raised just a little while ago, we would like to know that, okay, at baseline they were similar, but while the bicarb and all was going on, and it is an open label trial, everyone knew who was getting what. How did you ensure that your fluid management was similar in both the arms? How did you ensure that your vasopressor management was similar in both the arms? That your antibiotic policy was similar in both the arms? That your blood transfusion policy was similar in both the arms? We have no information about that. We have no information. Things that could independently affect the outcome. Especially in an unblinded trial, it is very important to know these other interventions that are going on after the main intervention has started. And we have no information. Whatever little information we have is actually presented as a secondary outcome. In the secondary outcomes table, in the outcomes table, which is table 2, pages 6 and 7, you'll find under secondary outcomes, they do mention something about fluid intake, mechanical ventilation, duration of vasopressor support. So these things at least look rather similar between the two arms, but there could be a whole lot of other things as well, as I mentioned earlier. So apart from the experimental treatment where the groups treated equally, we can't tell. There is some information provided, but there's a whole lot that has not been provided, and it's particularly important in an open label trial where everyone knows who is in the intervention arm. So if I say all the doctors and nurses were particularly careful in the intervention arm to ensure fluid balance, to, they will be correcting the antibiotic doses according to the creatinine clearance and everything, and they are pretty casual in the control arm, then that makes all the difference between life and death between the two arms. Isn't it so? So
Yes.
this is known as performance bias. So I told you about measurement bias that occurs which is prevented by blinding. Performance bias is also prevented by blinding. How you perform in the ICU. Okay, does someone want to volunteer for the 7th question?
I just wanted to ask a question regarding that secondary outcomes.
Yeah.
Dr. Preeta again. Is that when you look at that, it says the fluid intake from enrollment to 24 hours, other things from 24 to 48 hours, etc. But you're actually enrolling the patients in the first 48 hours of admission.
No, this is from after enrollment. This outcome is after enrollment.
Yeah, but all the patients who come in, you're taking them in the first 48 hours.
No. So after you have started giving the bicarb, from then 24 hours down the line.
Okay. Yeah.
That means bicarb is already going on now, or no bicarb is going on, and 24 hours after that.
Yeah.
Or 24
So they
hours,
may not be straight away. They may not be straight away.
So these are not baseline values. These are values after intervention has started.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, volunteers, please.
Dr. Anand had raised his hand. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah,
Dr. Anand Chellappan. Yes.
I have unmuted. Am I audible?
Yeah, audible.
I think
how large was the treatment effect? And here we are going to focus only on the primary outcome.
Yeah, so they have in the results they do mention about the outcomes, and for the primary composite outcome, which is death by day 28 or at least organ failure at day 7, and they mention the percentages in the control group and the bicarbonate group, which is 71 versus 66 with a difference estimated.
You get in table 2, isn't it?
Yeah, we get it in the table as well, which gives all the absolute difference.
Right. So let us open table 2. So table 2, this is what you're referring to, isn't it?
Yeah.
So they say the primary outcome was a composite of death or at least one organ failure.
Yeah.
So the composite outcome, they say 71% and 66%. You subtract that. Of course, they haven't given it up to first decimal place, but had they given, it would have ended up as being 5.5%. That 5.5 came as a difference from 71 and 66. Got it?
Yeah.
The 9% difference in day 28 mortality came from 54 minus 45.
Yeah.
And as Atul has already pointed out, this is a typo, this 2.8. Actually, it should have been 7%.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Now, the interesting part is that they very cleverly, because they were desperate to get some significant p-values, which they couldn't get with their composite outcome, they very cleverly slipped in a subgroup analysis of patients with Atkins score 2 to 3 and passed it off also as some kind of a primary outcome. Yeah. Whereas in the methods, there is absolutely no mention of them planning to handle this subgroup as a primary outcome. There's no mention. It comes to everybody as a surprise when you're actually reading the table that, okay, what is this? A subgroup of this going off as a primary outcome, and why not? I mean, because everywhere they got significant p-values. So they had to showcase something, right? So they put in this subgroup as a primary outcome, which is not correct at all. Okay, by the way, I've deliberately blanked out this 95% confidence interval because that pertains to the next question. Obviously, in real life, you never look at only the difference without looking at the 95% confidence interval. They are related to each other. So I am not happy. The reviewers should have actually insisted that patients with Atkins score just be shown as just another subgroup rather than making it appear like a primary outcome with significant p-values. Now, the subgroup analysis is a very tricky thing, and I just want your attention on this slide. We'll go over this busy slide slowly from the beginning. So imagine a result from a full RCT, a hypothetical RCT. There are 100 patients in the intervention arm, 100 patients in the control arm, 25 in the intervention arm die, 40 in the control arm die, that means 25% versus 40%. So the risk ratio is 0.625. That means 25% divided by 40%. And this is the confidence interval. The p-value is significant, 0.024. So we say that the intervention is better than the placebo because it is p-value is significant. Now it so happens that 20 of the intervention arm are males, 20 of the control arm are also males. Now the wrong way of doing the subgroup analysis is as follows, and this is how the authors in this Lancet paper have actually done it the wrong way. Suppose I say that I'm going to do subgroup analysis of males separately and females separately. Amongst the males, of the 20 males, 5 die. So that makes it 25% deaths. In the control males, of the 20 males, 8 die, that is 40% deaths. So the risk ratio is 0.625, and here is the confidence interval. Among females, there are 80 females, 20 die, that means 25% deaths. Among the control females, amongst the 80 females, 32 die, that is 40% deaths. Here also the risk ratio is 0.625. Anybody will say that, look, there is no difference between these two subgroups. In both cases, the proportion of deaths in the intervention arm versus the control arm is the same, 25% versus 40%. In both cases, the risk ratio is the same. And yet, the p-value is actually different, grossly different. Amongst females, the p-value is highly significant. In males, it is not significant at all. Why has that happened? Simply because the female subgroup has a bigger sample size than the male subgroup. The females are 80 versus 80, the males are 20 versus 20. So therefore, to give the p-value of an individual subgroup and say that, look, it works better in this subgroup is completely wrong. What should be done is a p-value of the test of interaction. This is the correct way of doing the subgroup analysis, the table at the bottom. See, the p-value of the test of interaction is 0.99. That means there is no subgroup effect between males and females. So if I just pick up only the Akin score 2 to 3 and show the p-value and say it works in that group, that's not correct. I have to show the test of interaction between the Akin 2 to 3 versus the Akin 0 to 2 and show that p-value, the p-value of test of interaction. So the answer to that question was, the primary and secondary outcomes are clearly specified. The primary outcome was 70% versus 66%, risk difference of 5.5%, non-significant p-value. The primary outcome has been separately calculated for the subgroup of Akin score 2 to 3. The subgroup analysis must actually be done using a test of interaction. So therefore, one cannot read too much into this Akin score of 2 to 3. And in fact, it should not even figure in the table of the primary outcome. It is a secondary outcome. It has not been pre-specified. Okay, so how precise was the estimate of the treatment effect? So maybe you can continue with this question as well, because it is linked to the previous one. Basically, what are the confidence limits? Yeah.
Yeah, the confidence limits are pretty wide. For the various outcomes, which is like composite outcome, it's minus 15.2 to 4.2.
Yeah, so plus 4.2. Yeah.
Plus 4.2.
Minus. Yeah. So yeah, see, it is crossing the value of 0. So 0 is the null value. When you're talking of difference effects, 0 is when the risk is the same in both the arms. So minus 15.2 to plus 4.2 means the truth could be anywhere from it being 15% better in the bicarbonate group to 4.2% worse in the bicarbonate group.
Yeah.
Got it?
Yes.
And there's a 95% probability the truth lies between these two figures, either from being 15% better to being 4.2% worse. Since we don't know where the truth may lie, it may very well be 4.2% worse for all you know. Okay. So you can't say for sure because the truth could lie anywhere in the confidence interval. So therefore, this is a non-significant outcome, and the p-value therefore is 0.24. That means there is a 24% probability that the result has occurred just by chance. That's what the meaning of 0.24 means. 24% probability result has occurred by chance. So in this table that I've shown you here, the least important column is the column on the extreme right, that is p-value. P-value gives us the least amount of information. because everything that you want to know is provided by the 95% confidence interval. What is the magnitude of the effect? What is the precision of the effect? Right? And whether it is significant or not, whether it is crossing the value of 0 or not. Okay, so therefore, this is the answer to the question. The 95% confidence interval of the primary outcome was minus 15% to plus 4.2%. Okay, now can someone volunteer for the 9th question?
Dr. Radhika, can you please?
Okay, so the next question is, will the results help locally? Can the results be applied to the local population or in our context?
Yeah.
The patients covered by the trial are similar enough to the patients we treat. So probably it should apply to our population.
I mean, of course, I'm not an adult intensivist or a nephrologist, but you know, these are the kind of patients you see in any adult ICU. And you get that information from table number 1. I mean, half the patients are above median age of about 65. 2/3 are men, with, you know, some quarter of the patients using alcohol, 1/3 smokers, usual mix of diabetics, hypertensives, ischemic heart diseases, and all that. Nothing very unusual, right?
Yes,
Nothing
sir.
very peculiar only to that country or only to France or something like that. The usual mix of patients you would see in any adult ICU.
Yes.
Of course, the question is, are the results at all valid? I mean, it's not as though the results are, you know, clean, the study has been cleanly done, everything is perfect. You know, there is one subgroup in which they have shown and they've done it wrongly. So that has to be answered first before saying whether it can be applied to a local population. It has to be applied to their own population first before it can be applied, you know, to our population. But anyway, if one is to assume that that study is internally valid, then I think it can be generalized to our population. There's no problem. Maybe you can take on the next question as well. Were all clinically important outcomes considered?
I would say yes, but I would like to have seen the primary outcome being only the mortality rather than being a composite outcome.
Okay. But they have given mortality separately also. It's not that they've given only the composite. They have given the breakup. So you are free to choose and look at both the only mortality outcome as well.
But if you had considered it as a primary outcome, probably the sample size would have differed.
It would have differed. That's true. In fact, even for their primary composite outcome, the sample size falls woefully short now.
Yes.
Dr. Atul Muley had explained how the study has now become underpowered because their assumptions were quite different from what their real life.
Yes.
Yeah, but you know, they've provided a whole lot of secondary outcomes, and it seems pretty comprehensive. I mean, they've looked at virtually everything under the sun as an outcome. So secondary outcomes include you know, fluid intake, how many required vasopressors, how many developed infections, length of ICU stay. That amongst those with Akin score of 2 to 3, again, all those things all over again. So fairly comprehensive. It seems all important outcomes of both primary and secondary seem to have been taken. So yes. And the last question, are the benefits worth the harms and cost? I mean, why don't you only address this, because it's no big deal. This is a matter of judgment, okay? I mean, authors are not going to tell you are the benefits worth the harms and costs. So this is a matter of judgment of the person who is critically appraising the paper. What do you think?
There are actually not much of harm in giving soda bicarb. Like they have not noticed much side effects from it. Second, it's not a very expensive drug.
Yeah.
But the thing which we are not convinced of is the benefit.
Yeah.
So right now we really cannot comment on using.
Yeah, I agree with you. Even I am in a sort of a can't tell sort of situation because I am not totally convinced about the benefit. Composite outcome, it hasn't shown. Mortality reduction, it hasn't shown separately. Even when I look at the Akin score, I need to look at the p-value of the test of interaction. I can't just look at the subgroup.
So, but even in the Akin score, the confidence intervals are very wide. And
very wide, yeah.
And for the composite outcome, it's almost, the lower limit is almost 0. It's minus.
I mean, it has become wide because the sample size has dropped, right? If you're looking at, that's one of the problems with subgroup analysis. So each subgroup has a sample size which is much less than the total sample size.
Yeah.
So it had only 182 patients, whereas the total population was 389. So when you drop from 389 to 182, obviously your precision decreases, sample sizes widen.
Yes.
And as you're saying, the limit of the confidence interval comes perilously close to the value of 0.
Yes.
So, okay, I mean, from the point of view that it's such a cheap drug, easily available, and if you say that, well, even a little bit of improvement is still worth it. If you are looking at it from that point of view, then maybe okay. But otherwise, it's not something that I will, immediately go ahead and change my clinical practice.
So I would have liked to see the sodium levels also in this, whether this use of sodium bicarb has actually led to more more incidence of hypernatremia. That would actually been a good measure to see.
That's right.
Because
okay.
that's one thing.
With that, we come to the end of this critical appraisal session. We've run out of time. We are at 5:10 now. I was supposed to have finished at 5 o'clock. So anyway, thank you very much for this opportunity to have this very interactive discussion. I hope you learned at least something from it. And I hand over back to the organizers. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Datta. I want Valentine to manage the QA session for both Atul as well as Dr. Saurabh. Valentine, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. So there are 2 questions for Atul, and then the rest of them are for Saurabh. So, Atul, are you there? Yeah. So the first question is from Dr. Sridharan and wants to know, please explain how you calculated the power for mortality as 42%. I think that's the analysis you did and showed.
Okay, so it's about calculating power and sample sizes. So you go to any standard statistical software, and one of the easy one that I like, which is available freely on the web, is openap.com. And so you just put into the software what are the effect sizes in your control arm, what are the effect sizes in your intervention arm, and what alpha and beta error you want, and it will tell us the for the power calculation, you just tell what the alpha error, and it will tell you what the power. And if you want to calculate sample size, same thing, you need to just put into the alpha error, beta error, and what effect sizes you have. So depending on the effect sizes and alpha error, if you put power, then you will get sample size. If you put sample size, then you will get power.
Thanks, Atul. The next question is from Dr. Govindarajan, and he wants to know how to calculate adjusted p-value.
So I think adjusted has got multiple meanings, and there are all kinds of adjusted p-values. So I'm not sure which adjusted p-value you are interested in. For example, if you're looking for multiple comparisons and then you want to adjust the p-value for multiple comparisons, then there are various ways.
That's what was meant.
And so Bonferroni was the method that was used. But the other places where adjusted p-values are used, or adjusted analysis is used, is you adjust for other variables in the model. So for example, if you're doing multivariate analysis, then those again are adjusted values. So I'm not sure which adjusted p-value you are interested in.
Yeah, maybe what we could do is he could be requested to write to you for independently and explain, and you could reply to that. So then there are a number of questions for Saurabh. So Saurabh, the first one is from Dr. Vipul Sharma, who wants to know, please clarify how the cumulative points are 6 in row 5 for bicarb arm. I think this is with regard to the minimization method that you had shown.
Yeah, I saw that question. So that's why I put up this slide again. Yeah. So we have enrolled 5 patients. At the end of 5 patients, the points are 6-3. Okay. The 6th patient scores a 0 for everything because age is less than 65, no sepsis, ACAN is 0 to 1. So because it is 0, although it goes into the bicarb arm, the scores do not change. The scores remain 6-3. It is only when the next patient, the 7th patient who gets enrolled, who has 2 points, goes into the control arm, that the score now becomes 6-5 because 2 gets added to the 3 which was in the control arm. I hope that clarifies.
Yeah, thanks. Then there's a question from Dr. Ale Anita, who wants to know what is the random element in this study.
In this study, there is no random element. They have not reported any random element, which is a worry as far as I'm concerned, because in minimization, if your research staff are, clever, they would be knowing the baseline characteristics, whose age and sepsis and Atkins score of every patient who is enrolled, because baseline variables are all entered. And if you know how many patients, prior to the next patient have had, what kind of distribution of these characteristics, you don't need a computer to tell you what the next patient is going to get. You can do it yourself. So to prevent people from doing it themselves, you need to bring in a random element, which these authors have not reported, which is a problem, especially in an open label trial.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Then there's a question from Dr. Radhika Radhakrishnan. How does interim analysis increase alpha error when we will do an analysis at the end anyway?
Yeah, it used to puzzle me earlier. I used to grapple with the same question, that your analysis at the end is remaining the same. That is not changing. So how does the analysis at the end remember that you have done analysis before that? Does the analysis at the end, does it have a memory of what you have done before that? Well, it's like this. The more the number of times you do interim analysis, the more you're exposing yourself to the chance that you might get a significant p-value just by random chance somewhere during the interim analysis. You have only a certain amount of false positive error that you can tolerate totally in the study. That is 5%, which is your alpha error, right? You don't want to use up that alpha error if you're doing multiple looks at the data in just one of those many analyses that you're doing. That is why when you're doing multiple analysis, that alpha error 5% is spread out throughout the analysis. Suppose you have 3 analyses being done, then some portion is left for the first analysis, some portion is for the second analysis, and only a bit of that 5% is left for the final analysis. Just for this reason.
Then Dr. Rajiv Sinha has asked, can you please explain again about block randomization? Saurav, would you like to take that, or should he write to you, because it's going to take time?
I think he can write to me, and I'm happy to.
And there's a question from Dr. Umali. Is there a particular range for precision which one would like to see, I think?
No, there is no particular range for precision. There is no cookbook recipe that if the width of the confidence interval is so much, we should be happy. If it is so much, we should be unhappy. Unfortunately, there isn't. So it is just a matter of common sense that you have to apply. The one thing I would like to caution you, that the width of the confidence interval is easy to interpret when you're looking at risk difference, as in this trial, because it works on an arithmetic scale. When you're looking at the width of the confidence interval for risk ratio, it's very tricky, because risk ratio, being a ratio, works on the logarithmic scale. So risk ratio of 1 means that the 2 groups are similar. On the lower side of 1, that means your intervention arm is doing better than your control arm, numerator is doing better than your denominator. The entire range of values is from 0 to 1. On the higher side of 1, where your numerator is doing worse than your denominator, that means your intervention arm is doing worse than your placebo arm, or worse than the control arm, the range of values available to you is from 1 to infinity. So a certain width on the lower side of 1 may look very narrow, but it may actually be very wide, because all values have got compressed between 0 to 1. And something which may look pretty wide on the higher side of 1 may actually not be that wide when you compare it to the lower side of 1. So one has to be a little cautious about the widths of confidence intervals, especially when one is dealing with risk ratios. With risk differences, it is much easier to interpret.
Yeah. Okay. So then there is a question from Dr. Aniket Prabhakar. Is there a need to write p-values I think this is with regard to baseline characteristics with when you are choosing controls retrospectively.
Controls that means you are not doing an RCT. Basically.
Historical controls, yeah, not an RCT.
It's not an RCT. So anything which is not an RCT, you must show the p-values. It is only in an RCT that the difference between the two groups has occurred entirely because of chance at baseline. In all other kinds of studies, the differences at baseline are not because of random chance. So therefore, you have to show p-values.
Yeah, and again from Dr. Aniket Prabhakar, even with allocation concealment, if we are giving placebo, the patient remains blinded. Is that right?
Sorry, say that again. Even with?
He says, even with allocation concealment, if we are giving a placebo, the patient will remain blinded. He wants to know. Does that mean that the, I think you answered actually that.
I emphasize that several times, that if you are doing good blinding, you don't have to worry separately about allocation concealment because that is happening anyway. In fact, that allocation concealment is remaining right till the end of the trial. Nobody will know till the end of the trial who's got what. But if it's an unblinded trial, then the allocation concealment is there only till the time you are opening the envelope and actually giving the drug. Till that time, you are concealing allocation.
Okay, thank you, Saurav. I think that's the last question for here. There are people who still would say they are confused about alpha error, interim analysis, and spending function. So they will probably write to you for additional information.
Sure, no problem.
Back to Dr. Rajapurkar and Aniket.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Saurabh, Atul, and Valentine for an excellent session.